welcome everyone. It's great to be here today. So 10 years ago today, a group of activists launched Occupy Wall Street in New York City. The plan was to engage in protests, to raise awareness around growing inequality, and to focus in the heart of American capitalism, in the heart of Wall Street. At the time, the plan was to protest and spend the night and start up an encampment, but very few people, I think, really believed that could happen. People thought that they would be kicked out by the police, but somehow they managed to stay and set up an encampment in Zuccotti Park near Wall Street. Soon, Occupy Wall Street gained attention from around the country and soon around the world. Supporters flooded into Zuccotti Park, and soon Occupy other places launched around the world. It was an extraordinary event that captured all of our attention very quickly. I was one of the people that was very skeptical at first. I had been to lots of protests in my life and didn't really think that this would have an impact. But soon I too became hooked and spent much of my time at Zuccotti Park. My colleagues, Ruth Milkman, Penny Lewis, and I decided that we should start to try and document what was happening. And we interviewed 25 people who were active in a variety of the working groups at the time, talking to them about their role in Occupy Wall Street and how they saw it emerging. We also interviewed hundreds of activists who participated in a large Occupy Mayday march that happened after people were evicted from Zuccotti Park. But we tried to capture that moment in the report that Michael mentioned that we released in 2013. This past summer, we decided to go back and talk to those people again, those 25 people that we interviewed in the first place, and to see what they've been up to over the past 10 years and to see what they think of the legacy of Occupy Wall Street. Someone pointed out the irony of the flyer for the event, listing these folks as leaders of the movement. Of course, Occupy was well known for being a horizontalist movement. I don't think that people consider it leaderless. However, people talk about it as a leaderful movement, that it had many, many leaders, and it was definitely a horizontal movement. So the folks we've invited today represent only a small portion of those who were involved in Occupy Wall Street, but we think that they give a nice representation of the diverse backgrounds of issue work, the working groups that they were involved in at Occupy and the work that they've gone on to do since. So today we'll be talking to Michelle Crentsil, Lisa Fithian, Jonathan Smucker, and Sandy Nurse about what they see as the legacy of Occupy Wall Street. So thanks all of you for joining us today. I'd like to start out first by just getting you to talk a little bit yourselves. What have you been up to in the last 10 years since Occupy Wall Street, and how did that lead to what you're doing today? So Michelle, I know you had not been new to activism when you got involved in Occupy. You had already been an activist, but you were pretty young at the time, and I think this must have been an incredible way to kind of launch into an activist life. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in the last 10 years?
Yeah. Thanks for having me here, one, and it's really good to see folks. It's been great when I met these folks at Occupy and now still being friends with them. I think that's a huge thing. Like in the past 10 years, what I've been doing, I've been still talking to Sandy, still talking to Jonathan Smucker, and a lot of other folks who I met there. So I think that's one of the most enduring things is just the relationships that we've built throughout the whole process. When you're really engaging in some of this movement work, you really build strong relationships, and that's, I think, one of the most important things. But in the past 10 years, and I can't believe it's 10 years, I actually came to Occupy as a union organizer, and guess what? I'm still in the labor movement. I'm still working for a union, a different union, but still actually a healthcare union, which is interesting, even though I took a brief hiatus from the labor movement to do some criminal justice reform work in the middle. But it is interesting 10 years later that I'm right back at a union doing labor activism and labor organizing work. So yeah, that's like the shortest answer of what's been going on in the last 10 years.
Thanks, Michelle. And Lisa, you were called in early, I think before even September 17th, to help people prepare and train for Occupy. And you had come into it from a long history of lots of activism. So can you tell us what you've been up to since?
Sure. I know it is amazing that 10 years has passed. Yeah, I mean, when I came into Occupy, I just turned 50 and I was planning on taking a sabbatical to write a book. And I was not sure what was going to happen either. I mean, yes, I'd been learning about it. I'd been in New York prior doing works, actions on May 12th. So I had a sense of something was building. And I was like, okay, I'm going to see what happens. But a year plus went into Occupy of my life, along with other work around the banks. And I knew that when I went, sort of, it was right before Occupy Sandy launched. I was back in Austin, Texas, and I made a decision that I wasn't going to work on issues anymore. I was going to work on racism, and I wanted to write my book. And I then had the privilege over those 10 years, because I'm also a trainer and I have had a movement life, was able to work in, do some work in Ferguson when Michael Brown was murdered. And I also had the privilege of working in Standing Rock, both of which I think have informed a lot of how I think about this political moment today. And yes, it's in the lineage of Occupy, but much more than that. They had their own lineages way before Occupy. And I think we need to remember that. So got my book done, been out trying to help agitate here and there, did some work with Extinction Rebellion because climate is key. It's all key. And yeah, just trying to stay healthy and continue to be of service is where I can.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Sandy, I also wanted to ask you about your trajectory. I know you were also young when you came to Occupy Wall Street, and so this is, I think, was a big event for you as well, as it was for all of us. But can you talk about what you've been up to and what you're doing now?
Yes, hi. So good to be here with all of you and the familiar faces. 10 years seems like a blink ago, and also seems like 20 years ago. So since Occupy, I have been really working at the local level. I've been able to help build a grassroots organizing center called Mayday Space here in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where we've become a home for movements and a citywide destination for organizing, building local power that gets projected throughout the city in different ways. I also am a founder of a youth green jobs program called BK Rot that was working around employment, working with young people of color, and also working around the environmental justice. And I also have been involved in street activism and actions. I was actually very lucky to be trained by Lisa Fithian during the Occupy Wall Street movement, and continued to take a lot of those lessons that Lisa taught us and go across the country and work with groups on everything from shutting down police foundation events, police benevolent association groups here, working within the movement when kids were being detained in cages under the Trump administration, working in different areas around fighting fossil fuel infrastructure. So I've continued to be someone who puts my body on the line and cause trouble in the streets, while also working really hard to build local institutions that can model different things. And then most recently, I just won a primary to be a city council member here in my neighborhood of Bushwick, Brooklyn, along with East New York and Cypress Hills. So been a busybody, but really excited to be here with you all.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Yes, you have a lot going on. So we appreciate you making this space in your day to be with us today. And Jonathan, we know you are very involved in Occupy, and you've written a lot about it since, as well as other writings as well. And you're also engaged in your own political work. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, hi everyone. Really great to be here with you and to see folks. And congratulations, Sandy, on winning your primary. It's really exciting. So yeah, I had a small organization called Beyond the Choir that Michelle got wrapped up in for a minute too, prior to Occupy. And after Occupy, we partnered with some organizations, or not really organizations, more like folks who were involved with Occupy, who were involved with other movements like including Black Lives Matter, including the 2016 Bernie campaign then, to kind of dig into this moment and what it means. And so advised some folks who, helped to start the Sunrise Movement, and some folks who went into Justice Democrats, et cetera. And then Beyond the Choir ended up kind of incubating two organizations in 2015, 2016 and onward, and then kind of dissolving. And my energy went into one of those organizations, Lancaster Stands Up, and then the statewide Pennsyvlania Stands Up. And we've been organizing in Pennsylvania. The other organization, Common Defense, military veterans who have been, who kind of worked trying to stop Trump initially. So I've been kind of doing a lot of different things, really focused the past few years on building statewide power with local-based groups that are building both electoral power and issue-based power. I'm no longer in a staff position. I'm resuming the graduate sociology program that I put on hold in 2016. So that's what I'm up to right now.
Thanks so much. Now, our program today is focusing on activists who were involved here in New York City, because that's where we're located. Obviously, as I said, this was happening around the world. But for New York City, as most people know, Occupy was evicted on November 17th, just 2 months after it started. And so some people have looked back and labeled it as a failure, saying it was kicked out of Zuccotti Park. If you look around today, there's still massive inequality, that Occupy did not accomplish major structural change. So I'm wondering what you all would say to that. What is the impact of Occupy Wall Street? And I'll go back to Michelle.
Good question. Yeah, so where to start with that? Where's the impact? I mean, I think for one, we can't ignore that we're still talking about it 10 years later. So that's like the most obvious point I feel like I bring up, is that it's still on people's mind. I also think one thing that I really learned that I think is a part of the impact of Occupy Wall Street is that there's sort of different lanes or different roles that activism can play, whether you're talking about movements or institutions, organizations, et cetera. Not everything has to look the same. And I think that's actually a tough lesson that I had to learn coming from the union world. It's very much an organization, an institution that had structure and hierarchy, et cetera, and, not having that per se, or not having it look like that at Occupy, but still seeing a role for something like Occupy Wall Street, a role for movements, and that a lot of institutions, organizations like unions, like community organizations, need those movements to work the way that they do as well, for us to do the work that we do well, for us to get sort of large material gains for our membership. We do need movements to sort of shift people's ideas and shift public opinions about things. And I do think Occupy Wall Street did that in a way. The way that people talk about inequality, the way that people talk about consolidation of like corporate power, I feel like it was different. I feel like there is a shift coming out of Occupy. Whether we think about how people looked at corporations, then you have Occupy, then we're looking at Fight for 15. I mean, yes, unions and worker organizations have been organizing low-wage workers for a long time, but I think having that large sort of public support of, people should be making a living wage. Like, we can't have these mega corporations at the top that are just siphoning wealth out of entire communities. For people to really see that as a popular idea and be able to talk about that publicly, I do think Occupy made an impact on that. And it's a lasting impact. It's still happening, right? That's still in sort of the main discourse if we're looking at elections in various places. Like, do we win all the time? No, but like, it's still a mainstream argument that I think a lot of people have to answer to. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And Lisa, as you said, you've been involved in lots of movements, many of which had been going on long before Occupy. So I'm curious what you would say to this question yourself. What is the impact of Occupy?
Well, a couple of different things, and I'm going to try and be as concise as possible. I feel like there's a general consensus that Occupy was a major narrative shifter. Michelle, I think right on with everything you said, and that not only shifted the narrative, but a way of thinking, and it has translated into labor victories, into electoral victories, into technological victory. It's translated into a lot, and I think that's undisputed. But I think that, I think one of the things about Occupy, and I may talk a little bit more about that, was the scope and the scale and the speed at which it happened. because what Occupy did is it woke up a generation, a 99%, where we've had movements for decades that have done a lot of the same things: the horizontal organizing, the mic checks, the convergence spaces, holding ground, this People's Park in Berkeley, Minnehaha in Minnesota. I think, Jonathan, you were like these have all happened before, but Occupy happened very clearly on the economic crisis of 2008. That the wealth inequality was something that community groups have been organizing on. So there was the political moment was right. We had the history, the political moment was right. And then we had a generation that had aspirations and dreams, right, of another world. And all of that kind of came together and made, and I think just Occupy off the charts, really, for a movement and all of that it's done and the impact that it's had. And lots more I could say about that. I was in Zuccotti this morning. It's a growing movement. It always starts small, but gets bigger. But so much of what Occupy was about was about changing our minds, seeing the world differently, thinking differently. Today, we might call it abolition and part of liberation, right? That's been the wisdom that's come from other movements of this last 10 years as well. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for now, because I'm sure we'll come back around.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and also when you talk about what we might call it today, it's also because a number of people, even at the time, had a critique of the term occupy and occupation,
Yes.
and that certainly has different negative connotations for much of our history. But many people went into this even acknowledging that and thinking about how that term might be different the next time around. But let me go back to Sandy and ask you, what do you see as the major impact of Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah, so I just want to add one thing to what Lisa was saying, because I think that was so good to like contextualize the moment, but also there was this big international global thing happening where people were occupying squares and toppling their governments. I mean, Tahrir Square was such a powerful thing that happened. What we saw in Algeria and other places where people were across the world under incredibly militarized regimes, dictatorships, like able to, with nothing but being in space together, bring down a regime, and in some way there was a changing of the guard in some way. And the same thing happened in some places in Eastern Europe. So I think like all of that kind of happening pretty within the same period of time, to me, was escalating a lot for people in the imagination. But I think, so just adding that, but for me, some of the things that I think are like, when I really stop and think about what the movement did and some of the like concrete, tangible things that I see and still continue to see like the lineage of, a couple things. One, the organizing around debt. I'm like constantly blown away by the Debt Collective, the Occupy Student Debt Group, that became Strike Debt, that became the Rolling Jubilee, that became the Debt Collective, that managed to both abolish millions and millions of dollars in people's medical debt that was bankrupting their households. They made significant gains in getting debt held by scandalous private universities taken away. They also managed to bring debt into the conversation. And now we have student debt. We had student debt just most recently as a major platform of progressive presidential candidates in this last round. And it's still a promise that needs to be delivered on by our current president. So I think that is just like one thing that I'm like, this is so incredible, this nebulous structural thing that is a tool used against people has been brought to the forefront. And we're seeing, I was just at a thing yesterday where they were talking about the debt that Puerto Rico is being asked to pay back. So this is something that is really important. And then the other thing I would just say in terms of the conversation around money and politics being like such a important an important kind of trajectory that like an amplification that came out of there. And I talk about how the context of the narrative, the 91% versus the 1%, plus the money out of politics, allowed someone like a Bernie Sanders to rise, someone like an AOC to be able to rise and change the way people who are running, someone like myself, who's like, I'm a movement person, I'm a progressive, I'm a leftist, to run for office, to not take money from certain places, to do grassroots fundraising. Like that is now a trademark thing, that if you want to call yourself something, it matters where your money comes from. And that being such a, like now it's just a thing, you know, where you get your money is so important. So I see those as two kind of major things that I always really can point back to as like really gaining momentum from organizing in the park, and the scale in which it's happening is pretty significant for a 10-year period.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Jonathan, can we ask you what you see as the impact?
Yeah, well, I really agree completely with what others have said. I'll try not to repeat them, but maybe just put kind of fine point on two of the things. One is just class, economic class. It was like there was a fog in this country for 30 years where you couldn't say the word class unless it had the word middle in front of it. And suddenly it was framed popularly. You know, and there were a lot of critiques of the 99% from academics of like, oh, the 99%, it glosses over all this heterogeneity within the 99%. That's true analytically, but it was a power move. And it redefined how people thought of the world and how people imagine themselves in solidarity with other people. So it put class back on the agenda and in a really popular way. I think another important legacy that others have touched on here that, you know, perhaps some people would see as ironic is actually leadership and organization. Because, you know, it was often remarked upon that the movement was like allergic to leadership, allergic to organization. It's a lot more complex than that in terms of the types of organizations and leadership that was going on in the movement. But a lot of people coming out of Occupy learned a lot of lessons of things they loved and things that they wanted to do differently, and went to it, got to it. Astra Taylor and I have a piece in the New York Magazine today that Evan Weber of the Sunrise Movement has some great quotes in about this kind of reflection that himself and other leaders that formed the Sunrise Movement had on Occupy, like what inspired them and what they wanted to do. So I think that there's a real legacy of building leadership and organization. And like Sandy said, there is an electoral legacy of Occupy Wall Street as well. Even though the movement at the time was not, kind of eschewed electoral involvement. I think it was Maria Svart who said from Democratic Socialists of America, who said to me when we talked last week that Occupy created opened the door that Bernie Sanders walked through. And I think that's really true. I don't know that there would have been a Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign for president if it hadn't been for Occupy Wall Street. And actually, my understanding is some very specific people in Occupy Wall Street who worked on recruiting him. So I think that's really, really important. And we just live in a different moment now where that kind of the movement work, the issue work, and the electoral work, my whole life there was a chasm. Now it's like people just see it as all kind of cut from the same cloth and all relevant to what we're doing.
Great, thank you. You mentioned some of the limitations. What was interesting is in going back this summer and interviewing everyone we talked to, or most of the people we talked to 10 years ago, no one had any regrets about being involved in Occupy Wall Street. And for the most part, people thought that it did what it could do at the time, given the political moment and given how quickly it emerged. It wasn't like there was a whole array of other choices it could have done as a movement. Still, some of you were, even at the time, working to push it in particular directions, dealing with some of the internal critiques and limitations of the time. So maybe if you could talk a little about those, what you saw as challenges or limits of the movement at the time. Michelle.
Me again. Challenges and limitations. I mean, I think I was another person who sort of came to Occupy a little bit skeptical. You know, I wasn't like just waiting for the day and like ready for Occupy. I sort of just like landed there. I still don't even really remember how I got there. I think it was actually completely by accident. I was actually trying to participate in an action. It was after the Troy Davis execution, I believe. And I just sort of landed at Occupy and was like, what is this? It seemed very confusing to me. And partly why it seemed confusing to me, I didn't at first, early on, I didn't necessarily see a lot of people who looked like me. It didn't seem to reflect the diversity of what I believed existed in the city. So I think that was part of it, and which also I think drove me to sort of try and figure out where other people of color were. It sort of led to the People of Color Working Group. And I think that was a critique that a lot of us had, right? And I think that also was a critique that I think somebody sort of hinted at around, you know, the 99% being sort of this really big tent, really broad base, which is great. You want to bring a lot of people in, but then sometimes it might sort of gloss over the differences that people face, including, you know, being able to have a solid like race and class narrative, right? Like I think we can do both, but sometimes I think the way it happened so fast and, you know, people just being able to attach this movement, it wasn't, you know, so beautifully thought out where we could have something that really articulated a race and class analysis that maybe we could do now in hindsight. Do I regret being a part of it because of that? No, I definitely think it was still something that I wanted to participate in. I'm really excited about. And it was also something that we pushed on internally. We did run into challenges. You know, so I was accused of dividing the movement multiple times because we had a People of Color working group, because, you know, people of color wanted to organize together. You know, some of us were accused of being divisive because of that, but, you know, I think that was just bound to happen. But I still think it was worth sort of leaning into those challenges. And I think it was one of those lessons that we took out of it, that basic, you know, the lesson, the way I would sort of sum it up is that we can't afford to have, you know, a movement or analysis that looks at massive inequality and class disparity and not talk about race, especially if it's going to happen in American society. Like, we just got to do it. There's no excuse to just say, oh, we're not going to deal with race right now, we'll deal with it later. That just can't happen if we want to have, if we want to see the change that we want to see. So yeah, I think that was probably my biggest challenge there. And then of course, you know, there were tensions, I think, around structure, leadership, et cetera, where there wasn't an explicit acknowledgement of leadership, but it was happening anyway. And I think sometimes when you're not explicit about it, there's a lack of accountability, and you can recreate some of the structures that we don't want to recreate, right? Where it's like, okay, maybe there's just a bunch of white guys making decisions elsewhere and nobody can hold them accountable. So yeah, I think those are two of my biggest challenges.
Great, thank you. And Lisa, I think this really is an area you've thought a lot about too, because you have lots of experience in training and dealing with structure and democratic decision-making. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you saw in the movement?
Well, first I want to say how challenging it is, because there's so much that's coming up that people are saying that resonates and I want to respond to. And, you know, it's like, and I want to, Michelle, you said early on about for movements to be successful, we need the inside and the outside, the margins and the mainstream. And Occupy was part of that story. And so what I want to say is that the learning curve for building a new world is steep. And that's what we were trying to do. And so as much as we tried to train and inform, we couldn't hold everything. And so that was one of the limitations, is not understanding the need to skill up and build organizers when you're trying to do something at that scale. And so that would inevitably lead to hierarchies with people with more skills, or right? So there became an inside outside. But again, I think just what Michelle said, and I was like, we didn't, as Occupy, white men will always go to class when you're trying to talk about race, inevitably. And Occupy did not deal with the cultural oppression of racism and white supremacy, of gender, misogyny, of ability, of class. We really didn't deal with any of that in practice, or much in how we chose, or maybe I should say that might then translate into not choosing to intentionally build a culture that would actually be healing and bringing people in, right? We got divided ourselves. So the other piece I'll just say, because there's so much I could say about so many things, but I'll try not to. We didn't, because Occupy didn't situate itself in that global struggle that Sandy talked about. Some of us did, but like Syntagma Square, I happened to be in Syntagma Square earlier that year where there was a massive occupation. The majority of people didn't situate that. And they didn't situate themselves in the global justice movement that was doing similar things. And so it didn't, I think we were caught off guard of the larger police violence because we also didn't have that race analysis. And so we did not effectively be able to deal with all the infiltration and all the ways the state was trying to screw us up. And that came into play with structure, because when we tried to build structure, somebody would always come in and blow things apart. And we dealt with that. So there was a tremendous, so maybe I'll leave it at that for now. I'm sure there's other things I could say, but.
Okay, thank you. Sandy?
Yeah, I was actually thinking when you said this question that yes to everything Michelle said. And yes. Additionally, I think about the time period. So we're talking about September, October, November, 2 months. When it really gained some traction wasn't until like 700 people got arrested and some women got pepper sprayed in Union Square. And so we're talking about actually like maybe less than a month and a half of trying to do something. And for those of us who were there every day was like a week, like time, like the vortex of space. It was like going into a black hole. So like just everything slowed down, and so many things happened in the landscape of a day, in a horizontal, quote unquote, leaderless space, horizontal space. And so I always say, I mean, yeah, there's 1,000 critiques, but I really just gotta say, like, we all did the best we can, not knowing anybody, some of us just not knowing any of each other, people meeting each other for the first time in a very tiny square with one of the largest paramilitary forces in the world, most resourced more than other militaries in other countries. And I just was reminded in Smucker and Astra's article about the $4.6 million donation from JP Morgan to the NYPD during that time. We had Bloomberg, who didn't give a damn about us. And so the infiltration was real. I remember my cousin, who was a Bronx assistant district attorney, had like come down for one day to just like take 5 steps into the park, immediately left because he saw several of his colleagues who were undercover in the park. He just was like, I have to get out of here. And I was like, point him out, but he just left. So it was real. We were also a place where many people who were homeless in the city, struggling with all sorts of needs that weren't being met by the city, came because there was food, there were blankets, there was tents, there was places to be safe, there were people around. And so the grace period that I just give us for trying to like do the best we could with all that, and still doing such by being together in space and having the ability to even generate a list of the declaration, just even the ability to generate that declaration, I think was such an amazing thing, amazing accomplishment of people in space trying the best they could, because they were really activated and excited and deeply outraged and looking for something. And so I think that's really important. And those relationships there did have tension, and there was a lot of storming, and yet so many people have been able to find each other after that, build together after that, transform where they were, which lane they were in, which skill sets they were able to later take on. And so there were always going to be limitations, just logistically. I mean, people were like pooping outside the parks. I mean, this is what we were dealing with. There was a week-long drum circle. Like, we're not dealing with the pristine, sanitized conditions of organizing as an institution. We are dealing with people as their raw selves in unstructured, unpoliced space with it in a little bubble surrounded by all sorts of forces. So I think we did an amazing job given all of that.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, I have such a poignant memory of the night that the police came to evict Zuccotti Park and being kind of at the protest zone and seeing people walk out of the park dressed as so-called activists, but then pulling out badges from underneath their shirt to like show the police that they were okay. It was a very painful reality that actually did happen and happens in many left movements. Jonathan, what would you say to this question about the challenges?
Yeah, well, first, I just fully agree with everything the other panelists have said. And I want to piggyback on Sandy's point. I like the word you use, grace, because it was incredible. So for all the critiques, it was incredible what was happening. I think in many ways, Occupy was the victim of its own success, in that it blew up so fast, and it attracted so many people who were brand new to politics, to involvement in social change work, and a lot of working class people and poor people, and middle class people who of the rising generation whose economic prospects were precarious, but a lot of folks who were new, and that came with its own problems, right? Like, people didn't arrive with a fully formulated intersectional analysis about race, about gender. There were a lot of folks working really hard to train folks and to do that kind of, it was a school where people were learning those things, but, often, not fast enough. There were huge problems. I think the flip side of this, Astra and I were talking about this, something Astra said to me as we were working on this article. She was kind of lamenting how kind of left Twitter now often feels like a space where you have to have a full analysis. You have to have all the language worked out to be able to participate without being like, said that, you don't belong here. And there was something really profoundly welcoming about Occupy Wall Street, where anyone could just walk in and could learn. So I think that was really important. So people were trying, struggling, racing against time to like do what we could. There were veterans from the global justice movement, like Lisa, like myself, like my friend Han Shan, who said, it feels like we're about as effective as a pebble in a volcanic eruption, right? In terms of like any individuals trying to like make a difference in how this goes. And so I think one of the really hard things about the victim of our own success, and Zeynep Tufekci has written about this some in Twitter and Tear Gas, her book. I think it's a really insightful point that, there was a lot of remarking upon the Arab Spring too, and some other movements were blowing up with social media. And it was the narrative, Manuel Castells writes about this, right? That like, we don't need organization anymore, right? We can just use social media and blow up instantly. And the analogy, I think Zeynep uses this analogy, is like, it's like suddenly going from 0 to 60, but without any driver behind the car. And by driver, we don't mean like one charismatic leader. We mean like the kind of organizational apparatus that can make decisions quickly in relationship to a base. And that some of that happen, and that usually takes movements a long time to build before they blow up. And Occupy blew up so fast. So it's more complex than that. But I think those are some of the problems. But overall, again, to me, it's like, it almost depends who's asking. Like, did Occupy have problems? Like, if, I'm like, no, like, are you kidding? Occupy was so successful. But if it's an internal movement discussion, I think it's really good to talk about some of those shortcomings and some of the problems that my other panelists have talked about too.
Yes, thank you. And I think that leads to, I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll turn it to the audience. But, thinking about these challenges is a way for us to think about what are the lessons for today's movements. We are in the fight of our lives on every dimension. You all are engaged in unions and direct action, in national electoral work, in base building and very local community organizing. Others are involved in, other forms of occupation today. So what are the lessons that we take from Occupy for our movements today? Michelle?
Yeah,
and for your own work, I should say. Yeah, for our movements and your own work.
For movements and for my own work. I mean, honestly, I think part of it is even just like this panel, right? Where we're coming from different like areas of work. And we're able to sit on this panel, have a conversation. There's a lot of stuff that we're agreeing on. That I think is the biggest lesson that I had to learn, is seeing the different lanes of work that I think need to happen if we're going to bring about, what is really, I guess, radical change, right? Like we're talking about a world and a society that we have not seen exist, like the changes that we want, right? Like we just haven't seen, like, have I seen abolition? Have I seen a society where Black people can live truly free? I haven't seen that yet, but I'm fighting for it. And I feel like we're going to need so many different lanes of work to happen for that to be made a reality, right? Like we're gonna need the institutions and organizations. We're going to need movements. We're going to need direct action. And, not all organizations can do all of those things. We're going to need movements that bring in people from, just activists from every walk of life that like come in at a movement moment, but might not join an organization and be a lifelong member of an organization. But we still need that too. I feel that's the biggest lesson that I've learned from my work, from my activism, is that, all of that is necessary. I've got to respect, I got to respect the game of everybody, really. I can't say that like the union will deliver us all by itself, right? Like I'm going to keep doing my work at the union with the labor movement, but I'm going to need help from everyone else too.
Thank you. And you said one earlier lesson is you cannot talk about inequality in class without a racial analysis as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, forever.
Lisa.
Couple different things. I feel like Occupy reaffirmed for me a kind of a lifetime commitment to building networks and decentralized but interconnected networks based in relationships. And Occupy, I think, again, proved that. And there's a whole new industry on relational organizing. And that was one of the things Occupy did. It was face-to-face. And that's always one of the questions. That's a key piece. And so the networks. I think another piece is that it's important to understand that those networks come out of an anarchist way of thinking and principle. It's not unique to anarchism. It's actually a part of nature, how we organize. And that's one of my big lessons. Let's learn from nature because she'll teach us everything we need to know about organizing, and more to be said about that. But I want to honor that this work came out of a lot of anarchists organizing. And I think we need to understand that part of the legacy of that can also be seen in the mutual aid work that exploded during COVID. And so again, understanding that we don't want to get stuck on any political ideology, in my opinion, or any label. And I'm sick and tired of everybody judging everybody else and taking everybody back down. It's like, if that is the old way, and if we keep going that way, we forget it, that we're just going to be the old way. So if we want a new way, right, we have to actually do what I don't call it this, somebody else did, like more trauma-informed organizing that's also rooted in anti-racist work. Because you can't disconnect the trauma of this culture from racism and white supremacy. And those are essential building blocks to a new world. The last thing I'll say is this, one of my big takeaways, and this has come from a lot of my anti-racist work in Austin. We've done a tremendous amount. When I went back to Austin after Occupy, we did a lot of undoing racism work and had to great effect. But I didn't understand backlash. I didn't understand backlash to the anti-racist work we were doing. And now I've seen it now on the abolition work and defunding police. And we saw it now with Trump to Obama. We can see all the ways that backlash happened. And so I'm trying to think more for myself when I'm organizing, how are we organizing to prepare for the backlash? And again, I think part of that for me is if we're doing that trauma-informed relational organizing, that we're going to have a better ability to withstand that. And I don't know, I'm thinking about it, so there's more to think about, but those are some of the things.
Great, thank you. Sandy.
Yeah, what Lisa's saying has my mind spinning because there's so much about it that is accurate. Like the relational piece is so important. And I think that for me, the biggest takeaway is that relationships are long, that mobilizations and the concentration of time, energy, and resources and time spent together can create relationships and automatic trust that there are often times when something's happening, or there's an uprising, or something is going, a movement moment is happening. I know, I'll see Lisa, or I know I'll see some of you folks on here, or I'll see someone like Nalini, and we just know that we're here for the right reasons. We just know that we can work together. I'm like, this person is great on the mic. This person can train a group of 100 people really quickly. This person can like bang out the art. This person can do the comms. Like, it's just like the relationship and the networks and knowing the skill sets that exist can allow people to kind of quickly come together and make use of something that's happening, leverage it, push more, make more space for people who are in institutions or who are governing to kind of push further out. And I think for me, as someone who 10 years ago was marching around saying F the state, and now entering this space, like the biggest lesson for me is how much in tandem things can happen if we can just recognize the value of both and the limitations of both. And that extends to both big things like a broad statement like an inside outside, but also within movements there's a lot of spectrum and differentiation that should be just like completely valued and celebrated. I mean, the social infrastructure of the left in New York City and arguably in major urban centers is like some of the most, we're some of the most privileged to have that infrastructure where we know we can call on these different groups of people with so many great things to offer in a moment's notice. And the continuation of building that out and not needing people to come to these spaces with their fully formed PhD level understanding of race, class, gender. We have to continue to make that so that that can ripple outward away from the urban centers into the rural spaces, into the places where diversity is not so much, but allow people to still participate. So I'm also like really on the relationships and networks thing, and thanks Lisa for bringing that up.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I think three things. So I was raised in one of those rural spaces that Sandy just mentioned, and I was politicized by racism at my high school, and through kind of a series of accidents ended up diving into a very small left in the mid-90s, and my first protest was around Mumia Abu-Jamal's freedom in, I think, 1995. And, we were happy if we got like a few thousand people in the midnight. It was like, wow, and so it felt like it was the end of history. We were up against the culture. It felt really small, and like, our ideas were unpopular is what it felt like. And the global justice movement was the first taste when folks shut down the ministerial meetings of the World Trade Organization, the first taste of like, oh, wait, for me, it was my first taste of like, some of our ideas might be popular. And I think Occupy Wall Street blew that taste out of the water, right? It was, yes, there was like this major countercultural component to Occupy Wall Street where, maybe more mainstream people would look at it and be like, oh, who are those kids, right? But the frame resonated. And so that was just an epiphany. Even though I was like telling people our ideas are popular, it's like on some level I didn't believe it. And it was like a lesson of like, wow, our ideas are popular. Not all of them, not all the time, right? It's not that we should never stand up for things that are unpopular. We can and we should, but some of our ideas are really, really popular. And that's one of the most important lessons for me. Now, to take a step back or forward or dig deeper into that, and other panelists have talked about it, I think it's because we're in a populist moment and we have to get this right this time. And this time, I mean still, because we're still in this populist moment from Occupy Wall Street. We have to get it right in terms of race and class, which has been the major dividing line and the major tool that has been used to divide people in this country throughout history. When you look at every populist wave, since like Jacksonian populism, right? It's been different times. And hopefully we're making progress on it, but this is a big thing. And there's really great resources that have come out since Occupy. One of my favorites is Ian Haney Lopez's book, Dog Whistle Politics, which kind of gives the history of the new strategic racism that's used to divide us. So anyhow, the last thing I want to mention is just, a epiphany from Occupy Wall Street. And I think a lesson that's really important for those of us who are sticking with this work to remind ourselves in is like, sometimes you need people who don't know any better to start something, right? I was skeptical like other people on this call. Stephanie, you mentioned you were skeptical. I was very skeptical of Adbuster's call. I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. When you have some experience, you can think of everything that can go wrong and you're like, that's not going to work, right? And on some level, you need people who are audacious enough to just try it, do it. And it, actually it doesn't usually work, but sometimes it does. And you need that energy. And I think that's really important moving forward is to kind of cultivate that humility around what is going to work, what's not going to work. We don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, some of the people involved in Occupy had actually even tried to launch Bloombergville, an encampment in Lower Manhattan just earlier that year. Some of those people were some that we interviewed in our study, and that you can read a summary of what we learned from our interviews in an article out today at The Nation magazine. That is my co-authors Ruth Milkman, Penny Lewis, and I. That you can see in today's issue of The Nation, as well as some of the longer excerpts from some of the interviews that we did and people's lessons from these past 10 years. So I want to turn it now to audience questions. We have a lot of great things to chew over. And I'm going to throw out a couple different questions and let you all choose what you'd like to speak to. One of our questions from C is kind of, well, there's two that are kind of balancing, like that we still tend to blame the poor in this country, that we, Occupy made a big splash in terms of shifting the debate, but it still hasn't gone long enough, and says Americans continue to look down on the poor. Landlords easily obtain mortgage holidays while renters struggle to gain access to federal aid. And along the same lines is this person is also asking, how come TARP, which made money from the bank bailouts, caused so much popular anger, and it doesn't seem that the corporate bailouts of 2020 did so. So kind of this question of how do we continue to shift the narrative and shift the common sense around blaming the poor versus blaming the 1%. So that's one line of questioning. A couple of other people, John and Vanessa, are kind of getting at this challenge that Occupy or all movements face, which is how do we build networks and organization at the national level and maybe international level? The global justice movement had all of these like protests around the world, but how do we balance that with building locally in communities? Like what can we take from Occupy and the actual impacts in our communities? And so if you have thoughts about that. And then another question here is from the point of view of the panelists, what was the role of formal organizations in Occupy, unions, local community organizations, the Working Families Party, and so forth? Was this constructive or problematic or both? So those are three meaty areas of discussion to chew on. Would one of you like to start with answering those challenging questions? Lisa, are you, looks like maybe, were you about to answer?
I mean, I could throw some stuff in. I could kick it
Sure.
off. Blaming the poor is part of the socialization we've been through that is deeply rooted in racism. Even though the vast majority of people that are poor in this country are white, it's a completely racist thing. And that is one reason why we have not been able to change that construct. So, and, even looking at, reframing to the wealth inequality is what, and with 1%. So Occupy started to get there, but the legacy of the old way of thinking is deep. I could say more about some of those other things, but why don't I leave it for now? Maybe other people will add in.
Okay.
Oh, well, let me just say this on TARP.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Well, just on the
Go ahead,
TARP piece. It's just that it was like, that was on the heels of the subprime loan crisis and the housing crisis, where like millions of people were screwed and lost their homes, right? And so that was where this well of anger and pain was, that is really what exploded several years later with the bailout.
Yeah, thank you. Sandy,
Yeah,
Michelle,
I just
John?
add a little bit to that on the TARP thing, because I was like reading the questions while trying to listen, and the question around like, but not the bailouts that came during COVID. And I think that there will be a backlash around that. I think there will be, when we emerge and we're able to be together again, I think we will look at how money was distributed, I mean, to airlines and all sorts of, I mean, the way that certain large businesses received a lot of assistance and support, yet we're still fully operational, still paying their employees nothing across the country, still not offering benefits, still putting their workers in harm's way. I mean, I think when people are able to start getting their life back to a sense of normalcy, I think there will be some reckoning with how that happened. The same way when the 2008 crash happened, and 3 years later you have Occupy Wall Street, like the effects of people being able to understand and reflect on what actually just happened. When the government makes major decisions quickly in a crisis, it's not always understood really quickly. And I think we will see that, because I think there were very clear mistakes in how some of that stuff happens. And I don't think we are not out of the kind of fire yet, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, there is mass foreclosures that are happening right now. There are people being kicked out of their homes. There is a totally wonky failing distribution system for the way people are receiving relief. Pandemic benefits are being cut off. So we're not even close to being finished. And so I think we will see that. And I think it's just going to take time, the same way the 2008 crash took time for people to fully understand, and the trickle down of that onto into the household in a protracted way. That's going to have some effects.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take the second two questions just briefly on the third one, the formal organizations. I think formal organizations played a pretty big role during Occupy Wall Street. They were following the lead, right? But groups like Nalini Stamp, who was a huge mover and shaker in Occupy Wall Street, was working for Working Families Party, and they basically were like, go do this, right? And do what you're going to do. Like, just like and a lot of organizations kind of like let their staff just help with Occupy Wall Street. But beyond that, they asked, what can we do? And it was, not to say it wasn't at all problematic, but in some ways it was really like the day that Bloomberg first tried to clear the camp, or clean the camp, he said, and 6,000 people mobilized by 6 a.m. and they called it off. That was labor unions, that was Working Families Party, that was Move On, right? Like, people organized, like called their members to come when Occupy asked them to. And so there was a really helpful thing. There was often a very guarded relationship from Occupy Wall Street to those organizations, a real fear of co-optation. And some of that was really grounded, and this isn't to dismiss that at all, but in some ways it sometimes became like an overzealous, like, we're guarding this thing instead of helping to spread it. And I think a lot of those organizations didn't often get the credit that maybe they deserved, but I think it was good. And And I think it speaks to how we need to build organizations. And that's to the second question. It's framed as building locally. I think we need to build organizations, local organizations, national organizations, all sorts of organizations. And also we have to recognize what they can and cannot do. There are moments where a movement that is unwieldy, that no one is in control of, is the thing that is needed. And organizations can play a role with that, right? But also organizations can do some things that movements that are that amorphous can't do. And we do need to build them. And I think people are building them. I mean, it's like crazy how much has been built in terms of both movements and organizations in the past 10 years. And building locally, I'll just say, you know, I've spent most of the past 4 years building locally in Lancaster County and then helping other groups in Pennsylvania. And you can do so much more in these areas than what people think you can do. Lancaster is a conservative area, and we turned out 2,000 people, which was unheard of for the Muslim ban. We turned out 1,000 people with less than 24 hours notice after Charlottesville. We changed the game, and you know, we ran one of the most, maybe the biggest field operation in the country with the Just King for Congress campaign. We got redistricted and kind of screwed, but really game-changing stuff from building locally. And the last thing I want to say on it is, I think we can blend creatively what movements have to offer and what organizations have to offer. And I think Lancaster Stands Up is a pretty good example of that, where we use some of the kind of momentum-based stuff that movements usually use, and we captured it into organization that lasts. We captured the volunteers, et cetera. And it's complex and it's really hard, right? I think that's just something that needs to be said on this call, is that this work is really hard. Moments like Occupy Wall Street, where everything blows up and there's so much momentum, are the exception, right? Usually the work is a slog and it's not glorious and it doesn't show up on Twitter. And we need that, and we need to orient more people to doing that kind of long-term work, building locally, building nationally, building all sorts of organizations.
Michelle.
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll just add a little bit to the questions about, you know, various organizations and institutions. I mean, I think they were often helpful, right? Whether they played a sort of, like you were saying, Jonathan, with like a sort of a backseat role, or like following, right? Or supporting, really, you know, where you had a lot of people who were active during Occupy, you know, myself, you mentioned Nalini, other folks who worked for some of these organizations. And, you know, I still think about when it was the first impending eviction, right? Like when you were saying at 6 a.m. or before that, all this mobilization came. And I remember seeing, you know, all these pictures of like SEIU Local 32BJ, right? Like all these people in their 32BJ shirts, ponchos with like buckets and mops and brooms and stuff, saying like, oh, don't worry, we're already cleaning up, right? So like unions mobilized so many of their members to get there to defend this thing, even though this wasn't the union movement, but they saw the connection between Occupy and all the demands that they were making on behalf of the workers that they represented, right? And so preserving that was important. It was within the self-interest of these organizations. And I think that's super important to draw that connection, right? Where if they were able to sort of stomp out this movement, stomp out Occupy, right? Like then those demands that they were making on behalf of workers would not be as strong as having all this popular opinion that was pushing and supporting Occupy, right? They knew that it made their demands even stronger. So I think that is an important connection to make. And like you were saying, you know, being able to build local organizations, I think is really key. Being able to build local power where people who, you know, can actually have power to govern the communities that they live in. I think that's always going to be a major goal, but being able to have movements that, again, can catapult those demands is what's going to, I think, what's going to move us a little bit further.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is that, the more places we have when these kind of moments happen, because I see someone saying like there was a moment, not a movement, people need places to go after, and being able to absorb. I think that that's been a challenge that I've seen consistently when we have these big moments of energy and activation of people, whether it's Occupy or the uprisings around after Eric Garner was murdered, or again, after several other Black folks were murdered by the police, or even most recently during this summer's uprising, or after Trump won with the Muslim ban. Like, all these people come out, and if we're not doing the work that Smucker is talking about pretty aggressively, and trying to get to solid structures and solid organizational structures, there's just the chance that we miss a lot of people who kind of then fade back into like doing the normal stuff they're doing. And we really have to kind of build more places to absorb people, because I feel like every time the numbers keep growing as we're using these social media tools, and I think it was an overwhelming experience, even after Trump, when Trump won, and everybody was just like, holy shit, like this, like, what do I do? And I think a lot of grassroots groups were very quickly overwhelmed with, how do we suddenly like expand very rapidly our internal organizing structure to absorb a bunch of people who've never been a part of a grassroots group before, don't understand the language, the culture, the norms, the social ways that we move, and that work usually falling on, you know, volunteers, people who are not paid, to just try to figure it out together. And so that is a big challenge that I see just over the last 10 years as those movements come. It's just like more numbers are coming out, and how do we pull these people here, keep them at our table, like bring them into these networks? I think is a big challenge.
Thank you.
Gotta have to jump in here.
Yeah,
Can
I was trying to say.
I know we got other
Yes.
questions. There's a place there are many different types of organizations and organizing models, and they all have their place. But what the problem is that there's whether it's labor unions, community-based organizations, or NGOs are more dominant because they are resourced in a way that grassroots groups are not. And so a lot of what I think we have to understand, though, is that organizing is not just about winning issues. It's about people getting a sense of their own power, getting a sense of their agency and the power of the people, right? Because if we don't have that, the rest of the orgs can't do shit. And so one of the problems with orgs is that in these moments, while it makes perfect sense for the org, they're going to suck the energy from the grassroots and the movement. They're going to hire people. There's going to be this thing that's going to happen, and it undermines the work in that other kind of organizing. So, like in everything, is like, what's the right relationship? And again, respect and knowing that they all have different ways. And a lot will depend on what your goal and intention is. And so, and people are different. Some people want to be in an organization and have more direction and leadership. And some people need room for creativity and creation. And Sandy, you're right. I'm a big advocate of building movement infrastructure, like the work you did at Mayday, because I think we need that. But that can also be done from collectives and cooperatives and other kinds of models that I think, honestly, we want to be rooting more of our work into. So check.
Great. Actually, I think any of you can just speak to what you've heard from each other so far, or you're seeing the questions in the chat as well. So go ahead and keep the dialogue going. Who would like to pick up on any of the questions you're seeing so far, or the themes you want to build on? You know, some of this is also, people are raising questions about strategies, like, can we continue to do nonviolent strategies in the face of growing fascism? And what do we think about, you know, the roles of direct democracy, a deliberative democracy, and citizens' assemblies? But then we also have questions about what was the influence of Occupy on the Bernie Sanders campaign. What is moving you to speak in these last 15 minutes we have here together?
I actually had a little bit of a question. I don't know if that's okay, but just as you were starting to talk about movement infrastructure, both you, Lisa, and Sandy, I wanted to hear more because I feel like that's something that is incredibly important. Even thinking about this question about, you know, Bernie Sanders and Occupy influencing that, like, I think having lasting and enduring movement infrastructure is really critical. And some of that came out of Occupy, and you can see that sort of replicating in, you know, other movement moments, other organizations, et cetera. So like, I don't know if there's more you can say about building out that movement infrastructure, what that means, and how to make it enduring.
Can I say something on that really quick?
Sure.
I think it's about the understanding the principle of keeping things small and connected, right? The bigger you get, the harder it is to do and the more you need management. And what we're trying to do is, I like using the word self-organizing. So we have to trust that people can take responsibility for their own lives. We live in a culture that teaches us to look to other people to solve our problems, and then we blame everybody. It's a sick, we're in a toxic culture. We're trying to give people an embodied experience, and they can get that by working in small groups. And I don't care if that small group is a Mayday collective or after school group or a direct, right? It doesn't matter. And then it's understanding the networks, how we're interdependent and how we support one another, right? So in these moments, and the infrastructure that I think about quickly is like, what do we need to live, right? And if we're doing it in resistance, we need to make sure that there's housing, there's legal, there's food, there's medical, there's all that stuff that we saw during the Black Lives Matter uprising that emerged again. Those things emerge, but then they often go away. Let's build them to be ongoing, right? Because we're going to rise again, because we have to. So it's like building that kind of stuff to support that rising, as opposed to plugging into a campaign or something else. Check.
Yeah. Not only will we rise again, but we're also going to face crisis again, environmental
Yes.
crisis and pandemic crises. So the structures we're building are also relevant for those moments of crisis as well. Who would like to go next?
I just wanted to add on that I think I'm 100% in agreement with Lisa. And also I think that, like, I consider myself, I always like to laugh and say, like, I'm a free radical. Like you know, I'm not a free agent, but I'm a free radical. I feel like I can come and go and be a part of different movements as I see fit, as it calls me, as I feel the passion in the moment. And I also feel very much a part of certain movement networks that to me are anchors of both accountability, responsibility, and community. And so I think it's like some people want to be in an organization where it's like clear, they have very little bit of time, and like what they can give, they want it to be structured because they don't have time to come around and think of everything. Other people want to roll as a crew, and they just pick and choose what they want to do. And that crew could be social, it could be most of the time, and then political or action-based in other times. And then you know, there are people who are just kind of moving with how things are emerging, and they're picking up skills, or they're building here and there. And I really think that having strong anchor points for people is really important, whether it be a union, whether it be this or whether it be that. And those are, you know, sometimes they're nonprofits, sometimes they're, you know, that which just have their own set of problems, but they are should always aim to be inclusive, find ways to have meaningful ways for people to engage, understand what they can and cannot do, and be in relationship to the places that if they can't do it, this is where you can go. They can't do it, come here, and be ready to take that in and also push people to where they need to be. And I think, you know, I always love that when like stuff's popping off in New York City, like I'll look out and I'll see like 100 different people that I've just seen over the last 10, 15 years. And I'm like, I know I'm in a good space. Like, I know that we can rock together, we can crew up, or we could fall back to the homes that we have. And I think we just need more and more of that, which is what Smucker was talking about, and find ways to respect it, resource it, value it, and find ways to communicate across those that are productive and not creating just like unnecessary clashes all the time.
I'd like to build on real quick what both Lisa and Sandy were talking about, because I agree. I think we need all kinds of organizations, and we need them. I'm not sure exactly how you said it, Lisa, but like defining their relationship and the intentions in that relationship, I think is so important. And I just want to give like a quick anecdote about a way that I've experienced that in the past couple of years. After Trump's election, we called for an emergency community meeting in Lancaster. We got 300 people to it, and we brought people into movement. And we started, you know, kind of the model of Occupy, kind of the model of the global justice movement part of it, of like kick off all these working groups that are, let people self-organize, and we pulled them into them. And it was wild. It was really a great experience. And at the same time, a lot of people struggled to find their place in them. A lot of people fell off. It's hard. It's hard for people who have no experience. Almost like 75% of people had never done anything politically, and they came into the room and they're trying to find their way, and it's hard. But good and worth doing, right? When we launched when the Just King for Congress campaign launched, basically a year later, it was, here are the things that we want you to do. We want you to knock doors. We want you to make phone calls. We want you to donate, and we're going to train you how to do that, right? And so very defined role. And what it was able to do was actually move from hundreds to thousands of people who were able to, and thousands of people participate in protests, but people who were able to volunteer in a capacity building thing. And then when that campaign was over, Jess King called for and Lancaster Stands Up called for a mass meeting. 500 people came out, and the candidate said, the thing to do next is to plug into Lancaster Stands Up, the organization, right? So it was this thing of mutual support and feeding into each other. And like Sandy said, there were a lot of people who didn't have a lot of time and just wanted to, do a 2-hour shift and have it make a difference. And the campaign role was for them. And there were other people who were developing as leaders, and we could foster that creativity, plug them into a working group, et cetera. So these things can go together well. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen.
Michelle, you are on the kind of the front of like dealing with those tensions within the labor movement, where we have a question here about building a multiracial working class and how to challenge, kind of a bipartisan ruling class that the question is how a bipartisan ruling class uses race in different ways to divide a potential multiracial working class. How can we challenge bad faith actors in that? I'm wondering if you have thoughts from the perspective of the labor movement.
Yeah, let's see. Oh my God, I definitely have thoughts on that. I mean, I think that's a challenge that a lot of unions face, especially if you happen to have a diverse workforce, and often with, depending on which workforce you represent, like these aren't necessarily people all coming from the same communities, all coming from the same background. They just happen to work at the same place, and you're trying to build some type of solidarity and kinship through that organizing. And it's just really, really tough. But I think where it's been done well is when we actually take it head on, when we don't pretend that it's not a challenge. I think sometimes we want to not deal with it because it feels easier. We're like, oh, let's not bring that up. What if somebody is like low-key racist? I don't want to bring this up. This sounds like it's going to be a tough conversation, but it's going to come up. Like, it's going to happen. So I think if we take it head on and try to do as much education around it, and also try and lift up the actual struggles of people of color and how it's tied to the working class, like how it's just tied to the working class victories that we're trying to win, without just glossing over it, like it's just going to make us a stronger organization. When we haven't done that, that's when we lose. That's just when we lose, right? And so I think we've just, that's what I think we've been trying to do at our organization, at the nurses union. It's been tough, I'm not gonna lie. It's been really, really hard. But it's something that we're committed to. I think it's something that is making our organization stronger. It's something that our leaders really appreciate as well. And I think it's something that the labor movement understands, or is at least coming to the point that they understand that this is something that's going to keep the labor movement relevant, if anything, right? Like if you're not on the right side of this, then you can just say goodbye to your relevance as a movement, an institution, as an organization. Like you will just waste away. That will be the end of you. And so even if it just is on that sort of self-interest of being relevant within this world, I think labor is going to have to turn a corner around that. And we're definitely seeing certain organizations within the movement lead on it, which is great. And, I think somebody brought up like dog whistle politics, et cetera. I know different unions have training programs like Runaway Inequality that looks at race and class and, different issues that sort of bring up that intersection. I think that's that's what we're going to have to do. And, you know, it's been happening well at some organizations, and, you know, I'm glad to see it. Can't say it was like that always.
So there's so much more to talk about. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, and we need to clearly continue these discussions. Independent media is one way to do it. We've had a number of questions about that from Democracy Watch now. But our time is coming to an end, so I'd like to give you each a minute just to share any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our audience. Who would like to start? Lisa.
I think just real quickly, never underestimate the power of direct action. And the more we can integrate direct action thinking and tactics in all of our other types of campaign work, the much more likely we are to actually advance what we want. Second thing, I said it earlier, but scope and scale. We're dealing with big problems. So we need to have big visions and big offenses. We have to go on the offense, and we have to do it in a way, though, that's simple and replicable, because that's, again, it's this idea of what is the tipping point, right? If just OWS was in New York, we wouldn't have had this thing, right? But it was because it spread. And the last thing is that, you know, it's kind of sick, but it's like we have to understand what I wrote down was like the temperature of pain. Like there's a lot of pain in this world and in this culture. And pain can ignite something, but the vision, the radical vision is what will move it. And, you know, I just feel like, I don't know, I think, I don't, well, I'll just say this. People who look for electoral stuff as their primary strategy understand that it's the uprising that is the game changer. And when we understand uprising is a game changer, we need to honor that and support that and be in the streets. Check.
Thank you. Who would like to be next? Who's on staff?
I'll just say that, yeah, I think the biggest thing for me that I'm feeling going in to this electoral space is just how much I fully believe that statement, that it is the uprising that pushes, like, we're not going to be able to get much done without some serious energy and serious momentum being generated from the streets that makes the conversation, that makes the issue an undeniable thing. You cannot not talk about it. You cannot not look at it. You cannot not engage with it. It becomes the thing that everybody has to orient around. Like, that has to happen. I feel really, really clear about that. And I feel really clear about just how fortunate I am to have the knowledge of that going in, to know how to understand how the organism, the ecosystem of it works. The other thing, you know, just the only other thing I would add is that on a personal level, I'm just so proud of everyone on this call. Lisa, it's so great to see your face, and just, I always just want to like say how great it is to see someone like yourself just like always out there doing stuff. I love seeing Michelle just taking on the work that you're taking on and being a mover and shaker in the union space and being a radical and a leftist in that space. And Smucker, just how much you offer to our movements in reflection and in helping to piece together like what is going on as it's happening in real time, and both as a reflection. I just want to say I'm so proud of, impressed, and not even proud, and just impressed with everyone here. And I'm really excited to continue to be in struggle with you in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'll go. Want me to go next? Is that cool? All right. Yeah, no, just, I want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to this panel. It's so good to see everyone and hear these thoughts, and also just reflect over the last 10 years, since I don't really take the time to do that. And also just to reflect on something that was really incredible and I think really shaped my life, and especially my life here in New York. You know, I had actually just moved to New York not that long before Occupy started, so it really shaped my adult life here. But I think in terms of like just my last thoughts, like you were saying, we've got big problems and big issues, and these problems and issues are they're super entrenched, right? And so I think it's because of the scale of that and like the deep entrenchment of that, it's going to be a long haul. I think we all know it's a bit of a marathon. And so, building out that infrastructure that's really going to hold the relationships and having trauma-informed organizing, like you had mentioned, is really important too, because people are really hurting. But then I think also just learning that we do have to build these broad-based movements that bring in a lot of folks, but we can do that while being intentional about the problems and very specific about the solutions, right? We can build a broad-based movement that doesn't ignore Black people. Like, we can do it. I believe in us. And so I think those are my last thoughts.
I'll be brief because I know we're over time. Really resonate with what Sandy said. Just like everything I see, coming out of folks who are involved with Occupy, there's a feeling of pride and deep solidarity. And I've definitely been feeling so reminiscent the past week working on the article I was working on and preparing for this panel and just thinking about the 10 years. I think I want to say, like, we all agree Occupy was enormously successful in so many ways. I think that the degree to which Occupy was successful has still to be determined and will be determined largely by the struggles of the next 10 years. And there's a lot at stake right now to determine, when historians look back, about whether Occupy was successful and the degree to which it was. And I know it feels like an apocalypse out there, but I feel so deeply hopeful at the same time when I look at the rising generation. I'm not quite a millennial. When I look at millennials and Generation Z, people are pissed off, fired up, politicized. Most of them are socialists. They're mad as hell. And when they come to power, it is going to be with, like, they're not going to take no for an answer. So I feel hopeful about the upcoming generation's ability to figure this out and to navigate it. That's all.
Great, thank you. So my internet is unstable and we're over time, so I'm just going to wrap it up.
I think, as Stephanie was saying, she's having some internet issues. So I'll just jump in here and really thank Stephanie for moderating just an incredibly interactive and fruitful discussion. Obviously, thank you to our guest speakers, Sandy Nurse, Michelle Crentsil, Jonathan Smucker, Lisa Fithian. We will share links to their work and much more in a follow-up email to this. So please look forward to that. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll see you on Thursday, September 30th for A Tale of Two Cities Revisited. A look at the social democracy experiments of the de Blasio years and the future of New York. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you to the panelists. Bye-bye.